Is the NHL better than ever? Pierre LeBrun thinks so. We have a whole lot to get to. And what makes a Stanley Cup contender in 2025?
You're Locked On NHL, your daily podcast on the National Hockey League. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Thursday edition of Locked On NHL. I am Nick Zararis, the host of Locked On Oilers. That is my good friend and one of the co-hosts of Locked On Penguins. And we want to thank everyone that is making Locked On NHL their first listen of the day. Locked On NHL is a part of the Locked On Podcast Network, where we've got your team covered every single day. And today's episode is brought to you by our friends over at FanDuel. Download the FanDuel app now by visiting FanDuel.com, and you can win up to $300 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. So, Hunter, my friend, we're in the early stages of the 2025 NHL season. Most teams have played somewhere in the ballpark of 9 to 12 games. We had the Frenzy on Tuesday, which was nice to be able to check in on a variety of different teams. I've gotten a little more immersion at where the league is at large. And I told you to read Pierre LeBrun's column because I thought it was an interesting conversation to be had. And Pierre's hypothesis is we are reaching a sliding doors moment in the NHL, that the teams that have been competitive for much of the last 5 to 10 years, Tampa Bay, Edmonton, Colorado, Vegas, Florida, those teams are kind of reaching the apex of their contender window. And in the case of some of them, Edmonton, Tampa Bay, they might be beginning to be on the backslide of their window of contention. And then he surmises that teams like Utah, Montreal, New Jersey are ready to start filling in that void. And teams like Anaheim, Chicago, San Jose, they're aspiring to get to there in the not so distant future. So let's start with one broad question that we have discussed basically every other week for the 3 years you and I have been doing this show now. Do you think the NHL actually has more parity than ever? Or do you think that everybody is varying degrees of mediocre and they just take turns beating each other? Because I can make an argument either way.
I kind of lean towards the latter, and then you only have about 5 to 7, if that, true contenders in the league each year. That's kind of where I fall, Nick. You have the 5 to 7 contenders, if that. Then you have a lot of, average to maybe good teams that can get in the playoffs. And then you have a bunch of below average to flat out bad teams. Like, you look at the league this year, and it's still insanely early, but Nick, the Panthers, obviously, they're the 2-time champions. I know they haven't had the hottest of starts. They're 5-5-1. They're going to make the Stanley Cup playoffs. That's everyone knows that. You look at the Devils. They have had a hot start. I haven't had them as a true contender. I've always felt that if they can get everything going, that's when they can potentially be a contender. But so far, they have been a blast to watch this year. Carolina, I'm still always in a believe it until I see it. Even, for example, Nick, the Red Wings have had such a hot start, but I gotta see it, man. I gotta see it for a full season under Steve Yzerman. In the West, Colorado, they've been a contender for a long time. That's always been one of the 5 to 7 teams, Nick, I've always had as a contender, and they're off to a really good start. Dallas, I'll always have in there too. They're 6-3-1 to open the season. Vegas, they're 6-1-3 to open the season. So you have, again, teams like Colorado, Dallas, Vegas, Florida, for example. A couple others in the East like Carolina. It's at 5 to 7 teams. I'll even throw Edmonton in there, even though we're going to have a conversation about them if they're potentially on the downward side of things. But you have those top tier contenders, and then everyone else is kind of, you can get in the playoffs, win a round or two, and then you may falter. So that's kind of where I'm at, where, again, 5 to 7 contenders, and then you got the rest where good to average teams, and then the flat out bad teams.
Okay, so expanding off of that, and this is something I debate almost every day because both of the teams I'm involved with, the Oilers and the Rangers, are kind of looking down the barrel of their mortality within their window of contention. And the first thing I often think about is, what is a contender? Am I thinking about it in terms of how realistic it is that they win the championship, that they get to the Final Four, the Final 8? And present day, I think if you can make the second round of the playoffs, you are worthy of the title contender. You deserve the merit of contender, because all you need to do is get through that second round and you're in the final four. And if you make the final four, you are definitely capable of getting to the final and winning the whole thing. Of course, where you fall on that sliding scale, it depends on a lot of factors. It depends on the given year. Some years, the path in one division is a lot easier than the other, and you have two really serious contenders play in the first round. Case in point, Colorado and Dallas last year. Both of those teams, I would say, fall into the contender tier, but because Dallas and Colorado played in round one, Colorado wouldn't have qualified as a contender under the confines, the definitions I traditionally use. And then on top of that, we have to talk about the alignment of messaging and intent versus what you actually do. There are a lot of teams, as you said before, who like to say we're competing, we're contending. And that's why I have started to break up those teams into competing and contending. A competing team makes the playoffs, can win around pretty consistently, but they're tapping out. They're topping out at the second round. They're not making a conference final. I think a lot of Toronto. I think a lot of Minnesota of the last 10 years. You know, Minnesota hasn't won a playoff round in 10 years. I think of the LA Kings, who have made the playoffs a lot over the last 10 years, but they're not a serious threat to go that far. I would dare say teams like Washington in their present construct, I would say a good chunk of the league falls into this category where they are competing. They can push for a playoff spot. If things break right, they get a favorable first round matchup. Maybe they can pull off an upset, and that's a different conversation. But I think the vast majority of the league falls into that category of we can make the playoffs if things go well for us, and we find a way to make something happen, because there are so many teams where their season is going to be defined on just making the playoffs. And the other part of that is, what are your expectations? You know, if you're Toronto, making the playoffs isn't acceptable. Even if you're not a contender, just getting in is, and we'll talk about Toronto in the second segment, but Toronto is not really making progress anymore. They have kind of stalled out. They have real expectations. Their expectations are a lot different from the Minnesota Wild. You know, if the Wild get to the second round this year, that's a great year for them. Everybody's happy. They won a round for the first time in a while. Everybody can exhale, and then we can have a conversation about, well, where do they go from here? How do they go from where they're at to true contender status? But it feels like the majority of the league falls into that box. And like you said, we have a handful of serious contenders who oftentimes run into each other too early to really debate the merits of true contender status.
Well, that's because the NHL playoff format is just terrible. I know Gary Bettman and Bill Daly like to say that they love it and they think it's great. Literally, I think every NHL fan out there, or 99.999% of fans, just do not like the playoff format. So that's where that is. I agree with you with that sentiment, though. Like, with Minnesota, Nick, it would also be a big positive if they did make the playoffs. Look at the way they've started this year, Nick. They have really struggled out of the gate. I think they are a better team than what their record indicates, but they've still really struggled. So if they're able to come back from that, you know, I think that will be a success. And if they're able to win a round, if things go right for them, considering how deep the West is, there you go. For a team like Vegas, though, Nick, they're not just looking to compete. Like you saw this past season, they lost in bad fashion against the Oilers. They were pissed off. They even said that's not acceptable for us considering what we have done since coming into the league. And what they go do, Nick? They went out and got Mitch Marner. They went out and got aggressive because they have Stanley Cup aspirations. You know, so a team like that, they're never satisfied. Like, yeah, it's great that they get in the playoffs, but they are one of the 5 to 7 true contenders every year where they can go deep. They have the 4 lines. They have the 3 defensive pairings. If they just get average goaltending, they're fine. And I'll say that for a team that wants to be a contender, if you have at least average goaltending and you can run 4 lines and have 3 very mobile pairings, I think you're a true bona fide contender in this league. I'll always keep saying that. So, you know, you have other teams, for example, Utah, they've had that great start, right, Nick? You know, they've been fantastic. Logan Cooley has been shot out of a cannon. Nick Schmaltz has been unbelievable to start.
He's leading the league in points into Tuesday night.
Like, I think right now they will be happy to make the playoffs. Just come on. Like, but I know, and the players' minds are like, oh no, we can do more than that. But in my opinion, I think they should be happy just getting in with how deep this conference is. And hey, if they get the right matchup or two, they could potentially go far. I like this team a lot. I like that they were aggressive over the offseason, getting JJ Peterka. I had them as a dark horse team to make the playoffs. I didn't think it would be this good to start. But for a team like that, I think they would be satisfied with the playoff berth this year. And then they would look to build on it going forward and potentially be one of those true long-term contenders. I'd even throw Montreal in there. I know that might be a hot take to some Habs fans that probably listen to our show because they made the playoffs last year. But this is a franchise that's really been building for the last few years. It was a very quick rebuild. Even if you get in, Nick, for example, you lose in the first round or you win a round, that has the makings of a long-term contender, even though it may not be this year.
I agree with you, and we're going to start to debate that in our next segment, because coming up next, Hunter and I are going to debate how long a window of contention actually lasts. When teams get into denial, what happens to them? Hence, the Predators, the Bruins, a number of other teams, and a whole lot more right after this. The NBA is back, and there is no better place to get in on the action than FanDuel, the official sports betting partner of the NBA. Even if you missed the start of the game or want to ride the hot hand, FanDuel has live bets on everything from who will score the next basket to fourth quarter comebacks. Plus, you can even combine your live bets into a same-game parlay for a shot at a bigger payout. It keeps every game exciting, especially when your team's making that late push. And right now, FanDuel is giving new customers $300 in bonus bets when your first $5 bet wins. Right now, if you were curious, the Thunder are the betting favorites to go back-to-back. The Cavs, after a solid performance earlier in the week, second at 6.5 to 1. My Knicks checking in fourth, 11 to 1, even though Cat did not look particularly good on Tuesday night. So, if you're interested, you want to have a little bit of fun, spice up your basketball viewing experience, head on over to FanDuel.com, sign up, play your game with the official sports betting partner of the NBA. Thank you so much to everyone who is hanging out on this Thursday edition of Locked On NHL. Hunter, my friend, I often think about the window of contention in very bleak terms. I'm going to be honest with you. We think these teams have chances after chance after chance. I think about some of the great teams of the last 10 to 15 years that really got one kick at the can. You think about those Joe Thornton, Joe Pavelski, Patrick Marleau Sharks teams that got one cup final appearance. I think about those Predators teams with Pekka Rinne and Roman Josi and all of that really solid defensive talent with Ryan Ellis and those guys. I think about those Henrik Lundqvist Ranger teams. I think about the Capitals only making one final in the entirety of the Ovechkin era. The Blues getting to the final and winning the one time they get there. Hell, the Bruins got to the final 3 times and only won once. You know, this is as daunting a challenge as there is in sports of how do you go from competing to contending and how do you stay there? And staying there is the challenge, because we have seen Colorado now for a couple years have really good groups, but they keep just coming up short. You know, you lose to Seattle in 7 in 23 the year after you win the final. You run into a buzzsaw Dallas team, and that's not like a fault. You know, the other team was just better than you. It happens, but we keep waiting for Colorado to really get back in the mix. Dallas, who we love the way they've built that roster. They extended Thomas Harley earlier today or yesterday. I forget, the days are starting to blend together in the hockey season, but you're starting to really watch some of these teams push chips in aggressively. Vegas, as you mentioned, has been the single most aggressive team in the entire league. And we are watching in real time teams react to that. Because if you're Montreal, do you want to have one really aggressive push, or do you want to try and have 3, 4, 5? Because history would tell you, you want to pursue the Florida model, the Tampa Bay model, the Colorado model, where we're going to make the playoffs 8 out of 10 years. We're going to make the conference final and the final 2 or 3 times. And that's going to give us the best chance to win. Now, I don't necessarily know how replicable that is, because you need a lot to go right in the long term to make that happen. You need 3 or 4 franchise altering players over that period of time. But at the very least, it gives you chances. And that's the key. Once you've identified those key 3-4 guys, it becomes a matter of filling out the pieces around them. And that's what Florida's done great. That's what Vegas has done great. And I would dare say that's what Tampa Bay did great when they were winning back-to-back cups.
I mean, the Penguins did the same thing, Nick. I mean, they finally were able to figure out the supporting cast. After they won in 2009, the hardest part was, okay, can they get back there again? And it took a little bit. They didn't have the right supporting casts surrounding Crosby, Malkin, Letang. They kept trying to, build bruising bottom sixes of players that couldn't score. Jim Rutherford comes in and he goes on a year to year and a half long year, Nick, where he builds the HBK line. He builds a fourth line, for example, with Matt Cullen and Eric Fair that can score when some of the big guns don't have it. He builds 3 mobile defensive pairings. You also have the goaltending. Boom, there you go. But I think the single biggest thing to staying there is really having those core franchise players. When the Penguins, Nick, when they were making the playoffs every year throughout my childhood into my adult life, a big reason for that obviously was having those franchise players that could put up, for example, with Sid, when he was healthy, 100 plus points. Chino obviously had his 100-point season as well, but they had those 2 franchise guys. You had Chris Letang as your bona fide number 1 defenseman. You had Marc-Andre Fleury for a long time before Matt Murray took over for a little bit. And I know the goaltending has been what it is since then, but the biggest thing for me is, having those superstar game-breaking players for years on end. You look at a team like Montreal right now. Ivan Demidov is potentially growing into a superstar in this league. You have Cole Caulfield, who can score at will. Nick Suzuki is still growing. Noah Dobson I really like. Lane Hudson is still growing as well. You have a really sound foundation there, Nick. Now it's about building around those guys, getting the right supporting cast so you can stay as a contender for a long time. Utah, they weren't happy with how last season ended. What did they do? As I said last segment, they went and got JJ Peterka. They built around that young core that they have, and look how good they have been to start the year. And they want to keep adding pieces to surround their young core. Again, Logan Cooley has been fantastic. Nick Schmaltz, Dylan Gunther, Clayton Keller, even Peterka is at a point per game. Mikhail Sergachev is right around there too. They have a lot of really good supporting pieces around their core, and that's what you got to keep doing. So again, it's really a multitude of things. Having the generational players for a long time.
Not even generational, just foundational guys to build around.
Your core foundational, and if you can get the generational superstars, that's also
that helps. That definitely helps.
Obviously, 100%. Building around those, getting at least average goaltending, and I can't stress this enough, having a robust front office that knows when to be aggressive and knows what it takes to win in this league. You can't be throwing out money for the sake of it on July 1. You got to be calculated with it. I think that's also a big thing that gets missed when you're talking about building a contender for the long haul, is the front office just has to be in line with one another, and you can't make those big mistakes that sets your team back years.
What's that Kenny Rogers song? You got to know when to hold them, know when to fold them. Yeah, some of these GMs don't. You look at the situations in Boston where we all knew that those contracts they signed 2 years ago as Zadorov, Lindholm was a joke. We all knew the Bruins were going to hit a wall and very quickly, and now they are beyond screwed in the long term. You look at Nashville, the situation Barry Trotz walked into and made worse. You look at teams that have tried to stave it off, like the Penguins, who are finally ready to take it on the chin, and they're dramatically overperforming expectations so far. We'll see how
Gino just said, screw you, Nick. We're not going down quietly. At least
apparently Justin Brazeau too. Apparently Justin Brazeau did too. But that's the thing. You look at teams like the Rangers, like Vancouver, who are looking at the Bruins and saying, oh my God, that's going to be us in a year or two if we don't get it together. And I won't be the GM who gets to try and fix it if this goes wrong. And that's the last point I wanted to make before we transition to start talking about some of the more teams on the upswing. These GMs have to balance those two interests. What is good for me might not necessarily be what's good for the team, because I can maybe sell my owner on, okay, we need to take a step back for a year or two, and that buys me a little time. But I need to nail the draft picks. I need to nail their development, and they need to produce. Or I need to swing a trade and get someone in here to buy me time, or I need to fire my coach. And you have so many cards to play. And the more aggressive you are, the riskier it is. That's why you see some of these GMs be very passive and be very patient, because they feel like if we play this slow and steady, I can explain that. It's justifiable. It's reasonable. I don't necessarily agree with that view. I think sometimes I can be a little cynical and think these GMs are purely in it for themselves. But you look at how some of these teams operate, and it's hard not to think if you're constantly churning through coaches every 2 years, you're running out of cards to play because you can't improve the roster all that much. We're going to take our second and final break on today's edition of Locked On Oilers. When we come back, we're going to talk about what it takes for teams like Montreal, for teams who hope to be like Montreal, like San Jose, to get to that next tier, what prevents them, and a whole lot more. Let's be honest, most of us can't even name all our financial accounts, let alone what they're worth. Between 401ks, savings, and investments, it's easy to lose track, and that can leave meaning money on the table. That's why I started using Monarch, an all-in-one personal finance tool that brings your entire financial life together in one clean, easy-to-use interface on your laptop or phone. Monarch has helped me keep organization of my accounts, track my spending, and get a better handle on my investments without ever having to touch a spreadsheet. I love that I can view everything, see and set goals, and make better financial decisions for my future. Monarch's visual dashboards and smart tools make it so easy to understand where my money's going and how to make it work harder for me. Do not let financial opportunity slip through the cracks. Use code LOCKEDONNHL at monarch.com for 50% off your first year. That's monarch.com, code LOCKEDONNHL for half off your first year. Thank you so much to everyone who is hanging out on this Thursday edition of Locked On NHL as we debate the merits of contender status. We talk about futures, trajectories. And before we get to the fun teams like the Montreals of the world, the Utahs of the world, I did want to take a second and talk about Buffalo, talk about Ottawa, talk about Anaheim, and these teams, and Detroit for that matter, these teams that are trying to take the right steps. You know, this is unfortunately the most efficient way to get to where you would like to in today's NHL. I know the players themselves are not actively trying to lose games, but the general managers are assembling these rosters in a way that it's going to be hard to win. You look at some of the rosters that have been put out there over the last 5 to 10 years in certain draft years. You look at the rosters that the Sabres and the Leafs were rostering in 2014 going into that McDavid draft, and those are abominations. Just outright, we are not trying to win situations. And for teams like Detroit, you haven't gotten lucky with the ping pong balls. The highest you've picked is third. And Seider's not bad. He's just not a franchise-altering player. You look at the situation in Buffalo where you have drafted good players. You have genuinely good guys in-house between Power, Dahlin. You had drafted Dylan Cousins, but you traded him. You had Peterka, who has looked like a guy at varying points. You draft Jack Quinn. You have two goalies who have shown varying degrees of promise, but it's not coming together. You look at the situation in San Jose, where for 2 straight years, they were an atrocity, the worst team in the entire NHL. The situation in Chicago, where poor Connor Bedard has to score a hat trick if he wants to win a hockey game. You look at the situation in Anaheim, where Pat Verbeek hasn't won a playoff round since taking that job, and they have shown no real progress towards making the playoffs. And it is so unbelievably hard to transition from where those teams are to the teams we just spent the second segment talking about. I would dare say it's harder to go from competing to contending than it is to go from rebuilding to competing.
I do think that's also a fair point, because part of it, Nick, is because losing has been in your organization for so long that it's really, really hard to get rid of once it starts seeping in. Like, it's kind of like a disease in a way. Like, once it starts, it takes years. And you're seeing it right now with the Sharks, Nick. Their head coach, Ryan Warsofsky, made that joke, Nick, man, I'd sacrifice one of my kids for a win. And yeah, I know he retracted that comment, but again, like, losing has just been in that organization's DNA for the last few years. And even though they have one of the most fun young players in the league in Macklin Celebrini, who I think is going to be a superstar.
He's a hooper.
He's disgusting. They're still losing
so far
because
away.
they just don't have all the pieces yet. And they're still a ways away, honestly. I do like, some of the start that Chicago's off to, Nick, 5-3-2. It's definitely an improvement so far from last year. But the main part of that is because Connor Bedard has had to be elite so far, and Frank Nazar.
Spencer Knight's been good too. I'll give them credit for that. Spencer Knight's been good when he's played.
You also need to shout out Frank Nazar. He has been awesome this year. 5 goals, 11 points in 10 games. Teravainen is close to a point per game. I'll even shout out Ryan Donato, who has 6 goals so far. So some of their top guys have been good. I'm curious to see how long it lasts for some of them. Like, I expect Bedard to be great all year. I know Nazar is going to be really good all year too, but I'm just not sure how the rest of that team is going to perform. You look at the Red Wings, it feels like, oh, is this going to be the year where they finally break through, or we finally done trusting the Yzer plan? They're very much, I got to believe it, honestly. So this is year, what are we into this, Nick, for the Yzer plan in Detroit at this rate? It's been a while. It's been ridiculous, but the Sabres have done a rebuild from their rebuild. Nothing has worked there. They got to get something right this year, or I think a lot of their high-end young talent is going to start asking out, like a Tage Thompson, like a Rasmus Dahlin, etc. Even Nashville, Nick, you touched on them. They can't score to open the year. They have been brutally bad to open the year. So I definitely hear you on that point, where it's also insanely tough to go from a bottom feeder to even respectable in the league, just because it's hard. Sometimes it's hard to find some of those complementary pieces that can really push you to that point.
You look at the state of things where it feels like we've been waiting for Dallas to break through, waiting for Carolina to break through. And instead it keeps being the Florida teams. It's Edmonton, it's Vegas. And you look at how hard some of these teams are pushing, where the maneuvering is aggressive. You look at Vancouver has, in the last 2 years, dramatically tried to make their team better, and it's only gotten worse. But the last thing I wanted to touch on in this segment is talking about that cohort of teams like Montreal, like New Jersey, like Utah. These teams where we see the promise, we see the vision, and we see what they could be. But 3 years from now, we could be talking about all of those teams the way we talk about Carolina, the way we talk about Toronto, where the Devils were getting to push or shove time, where they're 4 or 5 years into this. We'll say 4 because the first 2 years of Jack Hughes, you have weird things happen. You have the 2 COVID years. He gets the injury in the first one. But you're getting to the point where Jack Hughes is in the prime of his career. Jesper Bratt ditto, Nico Hischier ditto. You have all of those promising young defensemen on the way. The goaltending definitely still is a long-term problem they need to address, because Markstrom is old and he's had a hard time staying healthy, and when he's played, he hasn't been very good. They are right there as far as breaking through. They came out of the gate scorching hot. Jack Hughes has been one of the best players in the league. You look at Utah, who we've talked about a lot, who impressed me incredibly on Tuesday night against the Oilers. I thought they looked incredibly fast. They looked incredibly in sync. And then you talk about Montreal, who has paid their dues. They have taken it on the chin for 3 years. All of their guys, to varying degrees, are starting to put it together. I think for me, what they need more than anything is one more of their forward guys to break through. It looks like Slavkovsky is going to be something, but if he can go from being, a slightly better version of Valery Nichushkin to a bona fide 70-point forward, I think we're talking about a very different hockey team. And the hardest part of this process, when you're in that boat of going from where Montreal is right now to say where maybe New Jersey is how do you keep these young guys on schedule? How do you keep making sure they're improving, they're getting better, so you can give them more responsibility? And we don't have an answer. There is no one-size-fits-all way to handle these guys. You just kind of have to manage them best you can and hope things go well.
Right, I agree with you on that. And with Slavkovsky's case, you've seen him being a 50-point player each of the last couple of years. His first season in the league, he only had 10 points in 39 games. But, again, 23-24, 50 points. Last year, 51. This year, he's off to a decent start already. 5 goals, 6 points in 11 games. But, if he can get close to being a point-per-game player, 75 to 80-ish points, I think that unlocks Montreal even more. And again, I already like a lot of their young talent anyway. So if he can get close to that point, it only strengthens them and gets them even closer to being a bona fide contender for years to come. I love how they rebuilt very quickly, and it goes to show, Nick, that not all rebuilds are made equal. I keep seeing this, rebuilds have to take, 7 to 8 years. Montreal rebuilt in like 3 to 4 years, man.
In 3, yeah.
Yeah, it did not take very long. Yeah, I know. Some of it is a little bit of luck, but they also have a very good front office. They know how to evaluate talent, and sometimes you can do this in 3 to 4 years. Not all rebuilds are made the same. So that's my finishing message to everyone out there. If your team is rebuilding, if your rebuild takes 8+ years, I think something bad happened along the way.
It can't take 8 years. That's an NHL career. That's two NHL careers. The average NHL career is 3.5 seasons for the average player. If you're telling me it takes 2 full NHL careers to fix a roster, you're just being ignorant. I mean, Washington went from out of the playoffs to second place for the President's Trophy. You look at the Stars,
retool, but I'm talking a pure rebuild.
Yeah,
it shouldn't be taking 8+ years. Montreal did it in 3.
3 to 4 years is a reasonable timeline. Anything longer than that, you have somewhere in that process, you have messed up. Something has gone wrong. So you need results at some point, which is the hard part, unfortunately. You can put together a great roster the way the Devils have, but until you're consistently in the playoffs year after year, and you have the opportunity to evaluate how your guys perform in those situations and what they need to support them, you're kind of stuck. And it's a real peril, but at the same time, it's what makes this such a fun exercise and such a good conversation, because a lot of these teams, like Utah, love the start they're off to. How do they sustain it? That'll do it for today's edition of Locked On NHL. Thank you so much to everyone who made Locked On NHL their first listen of the day. Locked On NHL is a part of the Locked On Podcast Network, where we've got your teams covered every single day. For your second listen, be sure to check out Locked On NHL Game Night, breaking down every game every night until a Stanley Cup champion is crowned in June. Available wherever you get your podcasts or over on YouTube. Hunter and I will talk to you guys next Thursday. Everyone enjoy the hockey.